name is Miss Killian, and I'm your teacher for Focusing Question Arc 2 in this learning module. In this lesson, we will start a new text, We Are the Ship by Kadir Nelson. Before we get started, I want to make sure you have the materials you need for our lesson today. Do you have your journal and something to write with? You also could use your electronic workspace. If you have a copy of We Are the Ship, that's great. If you don't worry though. I'm going to make sure you have everything you need to be successful. Let's begin by getting our journals ready for the first activity. You've done this before. I want you to make a Notice and Wonder T-chart on your paper. Divide your paper in half, and on the left side, write I notice, and on the right side, write I wonder. Pause the screen now to get your chart ready. Here is the cover of our new text, We Are the Ship, the story of Negro League Baseball. If you have the text, you can inspect the cover on your own, or you can use the image on the screen. We are going to first notice and wonder about this illustration. Pause the screen and complete the welcome activity in your journals. You just had the opportunity to notice and wonder. I'm curious, what predictions do you have about the book based on the cover? Think about that now and be sure that you're drawing evidence from the illustrations to make that prediction. We Are the Ship is going to be our main text as we explore this new focusing question for Arc 2. Let's read it. The focusing question together. How can sports create opportunities for change? Remember, the big essential question frames our learning for the module. That's how can sports influence individuals and societies? In the previous lessons, you explored how sports can impact the way we view others. In the next set of lessons, your learning is going to center on how sports create opportunities for change. And today, I ask you to approach this text with curiosity and with attention. It will help us so that you can organize to understand what's happening in it. If you have the text, you can turn to the back cover and look at the back cover as I read this excerpt on it out loud. If you don't have the text, don't worry, I'm going to read it aloud. Listen as I read. In our day, baseball used to look a lot different than it does today. Back then, there were separate leagues for white and black baseball players. Although we couldn't play in the white major leagues, we hoped to create a successful Negro Major League that would one day rival the white majors. It took almost 30 years, but we did it. This is our story. And again, that's from Nelson's back cover. What words or phrases in this excerpt stand out to you? What do they make you wonder about the topic of Negro League Baseball? Pause the screen to think about that question. Is your brain going? Great. Read the definition of opportunities as I read it aloud. Opportunities. Chances to improve one's life or a situation. Favorable circumstances that make it possible to do something. Pause the screen and write this definition in your journal where you're keeping all of the vocabulary words for this module. Do that now. We're going to talk about opportunities throughout this module and throughout this arc. Can you think of an example of an opportunity? Pause the screen and record your example of an opportunity next to the definition. Here are 3 additional definitions that I'm going to have you record in your journals. Before you do that though, let's read them. Segregation. Segregation is a noun. The act of separating people based on their ethnicity or the color of their skin. Discrimination. Unfair or unequal treatment of an individual or group based on certain characteristics. Racism, the belief that one group of people is better than another group of people based on their race or skin color. Pause the screen and write those 3 definitions in your journals. Did you get them written down? Great. Review these 3 words. How are these words related to one another? In this arc, we are going to explore how sports can create opportunities for change. And we're going to do that by studying one particular example from our country's history, the story of Negro League Baseball. To help us understand when this took place, let's add some events to a timeline. So, in the first arc, we learned about apartheid. This happened in South Africa around 1948. During our welcome module, we talked about the Civil War. The Civil War began in 1861 and ended in 1865. Now, we are beginning to talk about the time after the Civil War when segregation, discrimination, and racism were prevalent throughout our country. Slavery was now illegal, but African Americans were still treated unfairly. All around the country, and particularly in the South, laws segregated whites and blacks and prevented African Americans from having the same freedom as whites. This is much like apartheid, which you talked about in Lesson 1. We're going to continue to think about segregation, discrimination, and racism as we read We Are the Ship. In our lesson today, we are going to examine the book and we are going to look at the text as well as the illustrations. We're going to organize what's happening in We Are a Ship. We Are the Ship. Our content framing question is, read it with me, what's happening in We Are the Ship? The author of this text, Kadir Nelson, he wrote the words, but he also painted the illustrations. I'm going to do a picture walk, and I'm going to show the titles, the quotations, and illustrations on my screen. As I do, I want you to notice and wonder in your T-charts in your journals. If you have your own text, you can flip through the text yourself and do your noticing and wonderings. If you're watching me do it, be sure to pause the screen so that you can look at those quotations, titles, and illustrations. Let's get noticing and wondering. Okay, let's do our picture walk. Be sure to notice and wonder. If it's helpful, you can pause the screen to look at those illustrations, titles, and headings for a longer period of time. Now watch what this does. Be sure you're recording your noticings and wonderings. Okay. So what did you notice and wonder as you looked at the quotations, illustrations, and titles? If working with a family member or friend, share what you noticed and wondered now. If you have your text, turn to page 1. If you don't worry, I'm going to read something aloud. I'm going to read the chapter title and quotation on this page. As I do, think, what do you think this chapter will be about? First inning, beginnings. I ain't ever had a job. I just always played baseball. Satchel Paige. Think about that question now. Now turn to page 2 and 3. I posted these pages on the screen in case you don't have the text. Take a moment to study the illustrations on this page. What do you notice and wonder about these illustrations and how they might connect to the topic of the Negro Leagues? Record your noticings and wonderings in your chart now. All right. Well, I noticed that these illustrations look like baseball cards. Have you ever seen baseball cards? I wonder if these are the men who played in the Negro Leagues. I also noticed that each card has a different color scheme and a different design. Some are more black and white or grayscale, while some have some vibrant colors. I wonder if this has to do with how long ago these were created. I'm going to read pages 1 through 3. As I do, jot down your noticings and wonderings. Be sure to pause the screen as needed to record those noticings and wonderings. First inning, beginnings. Seems like we've been playing baseball for a mighty long time, at least as long as we've been free. Baseball's the best game there ever was. It's a beautifully designed game that requires a quick wit, a strong body, and a cool head. They say baseball was invented by a fellow named Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown, New York, back in the mid-1800s. But that is just another tall tale, 'cause no one really knows for sure. But one thing is for sure. Soon after that, you could find a baseball game being played just about everywhere in this grand old country of ours, particularly in the big cities like New York and Chicago. People of all types love to play and watch the game. Irish, Italian, German, Cuban, Puerto Rican, and African American. But back then, we were called Negro or colored. Every neighborhood and every town had a team, and they would all play one another. Before long, there were professional teams and organized leagues. A league is an organized group of teams that play against each other in a particular sport. All right, back to the text. In the mid-1860s, most professional baseball teams had only white ball players. There were a number of Negroes who did play, though they weren't treated any better than most Negroes in the country at the time. Truth is, those poor fellows were treated downright disgracefully. They were called just about every horrible name in the book, and then some. Several teams wouldn't play another team if it had a Negro on the roster. And in some states, Negroes weren't allowed to play at all. When we did play, we got the wrong directions from our manager and were targets for opposing pitchers and base runners, which was a dangerous thing because back in those days, no one wore any protective gear, not even the catcher. Well, that was until Bud Fowler, the first Negro to play professional baseball, came along. Too many times he was forced to leave the field on crutches after being spiked by a base runner. Now this was a terrible thing, but some good came out of it. His scarred shins gave him the idea to attach wooden staves from a barrel to his legs for protection. They were the first shin guards and the first protective gear in baseball. They just about saved his legs and his baseball career, or what was left of it anyway. And don't you know that those white fellows tried like the dickens to break his shin guards? It just gave him a little more ambition to slide feet first when a Negro was covering the base. Despite the cruel treatment Negroes received, there were a few who became quite good ball players, like brothers Wellday and Moses, Fleetwood Walker, Charlie Grant, Pete Hill, Sol White, Grant Home Run Johnson, Ben Taylor, and Frank Graham. These fellows were great ball players by any measure, but none of that mattered because they were still Negroes, and most white ball players didn't want to play alongside them. By the late 1800s, Negroes began to disappear from professional baseball teams and were soon gone from them altogether. Now, there was never any written rule that prohibited, to prohibit means to stop, Negroes from playing professional baseball. But soon after 1887, somehow, Negroes all over couldn't get on professional baseball team. Come to find out that all the white owners had gotten together in secret and decided to do away with Negroes in professional baseball. They agreed not to add any more to their teams and to let go of the ones they had, called it a gentleman's agreement. And I'll tell you this, the white pro ball club owners held to that agreement for almost 60 years. So, what were we Negroes left to do? We loved to play baseball, and a lot of guys had genuine talent. Sure, we could play against small, semi-pro teams which paid little, if at all, or swallow our pride and get a job working in some factory. But who wanted to do that? Especially after tasting the fruits of what professional baseball had to offer. We had no choice but to start our own professional teams, our own leagues, and that's just what we did. In the early 1900s, there were many Negro baseball teams all over the Northeast and South. Soon after the Great Migration of Negroes from the southern states to northern cities, during the 20s, Negro baseball began to grow. Negroes tried several times to organize professional leagues, but they never lasted long because they didn't have the money or the leadership to stay in the business. Then came Ruby. I'm going to show page 3 in the text. As I show it, I want you to think, who is telling the story and what makes you think so? you should see page 3. I'm going to reread the first full paragraph on page 3. As I do, I want you to think about that question. Who is telling the story and what makes you think so? So what were we Negroes left to do? We loved to play baseball, and a lot of guys had genuine talent. Sure, we could play against small, semi-pro teams which paid little, if at all, or swallow our pride and get a job working in some factory. But who wanted to do that? Especially after tasting the fruits of what professional baseball had to offer. We had no choice but to start our own professional teams, our own leagues. And that's just what we did. So who do you think is telling the story? I noticed that the narrator refers to we a lot. Did you see that? The narrator refers to we in the text a few different times. Here and here. I wonder if maybe the narrator is one of the professional or one of the Black Negro League players. On the screen, I have a question, and I want you to pause the screen to record the answer to this in your journal. If you have your text, you can skim through pages 1 through 3 again. If not, you can return to the read aloud and re-listen if it helps you. Name 3 big ideas that you learned from the narrator in these first 3 pages. My challenge for you is, can you use our words that we learned earlier in this lesson, segregation, discrimination, and racism, in your response? Pause the screen now so that you can do this in your journal. So, did you write it in your journal? Great. Did you use segregation, discrimination, and racism? If so, give yourself some snaps. I'm going to share some noticings that some other students came up with. Remember, I'm not sharing these because they're the right answers, but because helping to learn what others think will help us expand our thinking. One of my students noticed how the Black baseball players who tried out for the professional leagues at first were able to play with them, and then they weren't later on. That made her wonder what changed. Did you have some big ideas that you also learned? Now let's study the illustrations on pages 2 and 3 again. If you have your text, you can open up to page 2 and 3. If not, they're on the screen. I want you to consider how the illustrations support your understanding of the big ideas so far. Okay, so look at these illustrations and think, how do they support your ideas, support your conclusion of the big ideas? Pause the screen now to record this in your journal. These images show some of the ball players who the narrator tells us played in the professional leagues before they started allowing Black players. Now we're going to move into reading the rest of the chapter. Before we do, let's look closely at some of the images in the pages we're going to read. And we're going to notice and wonder. So what do you need? Yes, your notice and wonder charts, so get those out. This is page 4. If you have your text, you can look at page 4. If not, it's on the screen. What do you notice and wonder about the illustration on page 4? Jot your noticings and wonderings on your charts. Now let's look at the spread on pages 6 and 7. What do you notice and wonder about these illustrations? Record them in your chart. Pause the screen as needed. I'm going to read page 5. As I do, jot down your noticings and wonderings. Be sure to pause the screen every so often to record them. Andrew Rube Foster was an old-time trick pitcher who'd come up from the Texas leagues. He was a preacher's son who called everybody darlin'. Like most ball players in his day, he bounced around from team to team before he landed in Chicago with the Leland Giants, who later became the Chicago American Giants, where he both played and managed. Back then, managers almost always played because the owners couldn't afford to pay a man to just sit in the dugout. Rube was a master, a brilliant man. He knew baseball like the back of his hand, and most important, he knew how to win. He was a demanding manager and only wanted ball players who would follow his instructions. If a ball player didn't listen to Rube, he didn't last long. His players had to be able to bunt the ball into a hat consistently. All of them were fast, and if they got on base, it was over. They'd steal your shirt. Rube's game was built around speed and his own invention called the bunt and run. It was a simple play. They'd put a racehorse on first base, and the batter would bunt the ball down the third baseline. The runner would lead off the base with the pitch and be halfway around the bases by the time the ball hit the bat. The runner didn't stop at second and kept charging full speed toward third, which was left unguarded because the third baseman had to come in to pick up the ball. If the third baseman played behind the base, it was an automatic hit. If he came in, the runner slid safely into third. The play was just about impossible to defend against. It also worked if a man was on second, except the runner would run all the way home. They did this for 9 innings, and let me tell you, those fellows would bunt and run you to death, drove pitchers crazy. And the pitchers, they got their pitching instructions from Rube sitting in the dugout, not from the catcher, which was more common. He'd puff signals from his pipe or nod his head one way to signal a play, 1 puff fastball, 2 puffs curveball, things like that. They beat everybody that way. Rube's American Giants became the strongest Negro team in Chicago and the most famous independent team in the entire Midwest. Sometimes they even drew larger crowds than the local Major League Cubs or the White Sox. Rube ran his ball club like it was a major league team. Most Negro teams back then weren't very well organized, didn't always have enough equipment or even matching uniforms. Most times they went from game to game, scattered among different cars, or sometimes they'd even have to hobo, which means hitch a ride on the back of someone's truck to get to the next town for a game. But not Rube's team. They were always well equipped with clean new uniforms, bats, and balls. They rode to the game in fancy Pullman cars Rube rented and hitched to the back of a train. It was something to see that group of Negroes step out of the train dressed in suits and hats. They were big leaguers. So what were your noticings and wonderings as we read that page? If you're working with someone, pause the screen now to share those. If not, just skim over what you wrote. We just read about Rube Foster. Who was Rube Foster? What was he like? Think about it now. Study the illustration and skim the words if it helps you answer that question. Did you think about it? Great. Now you're going to answer this question in your journal. Who was Rube Foster? What was he like? Write it down. Using the illustration and text, you may have concluded that Rube Foster was a baseball player as well as a manager. He was smart and he demanded work from his players. He ran a successful, organized team, almost like a professional team. Now pause the screen and look at the illustrations of Rube Foster and his team. These are from pages 4, 6, and 7. As you do, I want you to think about how the illustrations support what you learned about Rube and his team when we read the text. Pause the screen and think about that now. Got it? Great. Let's look at page 4 first. Here is the illustration on page 4. I noticed that Rube is in a suit. Did you see that too? Yes. And what does he have in his mouth? He has his pipe. That's what I think. I noticed some baseball players practicing in the background. This illustration for me supports the text where it said that he was a dignified team manager. Now if I look at the spread on pages 6 and 7, I notice that this is a train platform. And I think that these must be the players, looking dapper in their suits, on their way to play a game. I notice there's children looking up at them in awe. I think this fosters the idea that was supported in the text, that they were just like big leaguers. Did you come to some of those conclusions too? Great. So before we read the rest of the text, we're going to look at a few more illustrations and notice and wonder. So turn back to your notice and wonder chart. And if you have your text, you can look at pages 10 through 15 on your own, or you can look at what I have on the screen. This is that spread that opens up. What do you notice and wonder about these illustrations? Record it in your notice and wonder charts now. I'm going to read page 9. Pause the screen as needed to continue adding noticings and wonderings to your T-chart. It was after this success with the American Giants that Rube decided to organize an entire Negro baseball league. Rube aimed high. He wanted to create a league that would exhibit a professional level of play, equal to or better than the majors, so that when it came time to integrate professional baseball, Negroes would be ready. See, Rube didn't want to put just 1 or 2 Negroes in the major leagues. He wanted to put a whole league into the major leagues. There would be the American League, the National League, and the Negro League. Rube knew that if Negroes were to play in a professional league, we'd have to organize it ourselves. We are the ship, he proudly declared, all else the sea. On February 20th, 1920, Rube called together all the owners of black baseball teams in the Midwest. They agreed to a set of rules that the league would follow. Rules that would stop player raids between teams and police the players' conduct on and off the field. They named the league the Negro National League. It had 8 teams: the Cuban Stars, the Detroit Stars, the Chicago American Giants, the Chicago Giants, the Kansas City Monarchs, the St. Louis Stars, the Indianapolis ABCs, and the Dayton Marcos. Rube's league was home to great players, the likes of Oscar Charleston, Cyclone or Smokey Joe Williams, Ben Taylor, Cannonball, Dick Redding, and John Henry Pop Lloyd. Rube took it upon himself to keep the league going. If a team wasn't doing well, he would help them out with a little cash. If there was a dispute, that's an argument, if there was a dispute between a player and an owner, he would settle it. He gave black baseball dignity and set the standard for things to come. His league was so successful that a group of white owners of independent Negro teams formed a rival league of their own. A rival's kind of like an enemy. The Eastern Colored League, just a few years after Rube started his. The pennant winners from each league met in a Colored World Series at the end of the season. Did you get your noticings and wonderings down as I read? Okay. Let's return to this foldout on pages 10 through 15. If you have it in the text, you can look at it now. How does these illustrations support what you learned about Rube Foster's Negro Leagues from the text on page 9? Look at those illustrations again and think, how are they supported by what's in the text? You may have noticed that the outside flaps are a ticket. Do you see that? They're a ticket to the first Colored World Series. This happened on October 11, 1924 in Kansas City, Missouri. The inside flaps show the two teams, the KC Monarchs and the Hilldale Club. They were the ones who were playing in that championship. So we have completed first inning, which is the first chapter of our new text. And we are going to summarize what we learned about the Negro Leagues. Have you summarized before? Summarizing a text or a portion of text after reading can help us to think more deeply and to understand that text. We can summarize at a paragraph level, or we can summarize the text as a whole thing. So what you're going to do now is on a new page in your journal, you are going to answer this question by writing 2 to 3 sentences explaining what you learned about the Negro Leagues. Okay? Be sure that your summary explains what the Negro Leagues are and how and why they were started. Pause the screen and complete your summary now. I'm going to show an example of one of my students' summaries of first inning. When I show it, I want you to check it, and I want you to think, did this student include what the Negro Leagues are and how and why they started? Okay, so read it on your own and think, did this student do that? Did she include what the Negro Leagues were? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Yes, she did. Let's read it. The Negro Leagues baseball teams were created for black baseball players that weren't allowed to play on white professional teams. She did it. Did she include how the Negro Leagues began? Let's see. Rube Foster began the leagues and treated his players well. Did she include why the Negro Leagues began? Let's see. He wanted them to be ready to play in the major leagues if the day ever came. Oh, so that's the why. Did she do all 3 things? Yes. Now I want you to go back to your writing and I want you to check. Did you include all of those? It doesn't have to be the same exact information, but did you put the what, the how, and why? Pause the screen so that you can revise your 2 to 3 sentence summary if needed. As we near the end of this lesson, let's reflect on all we learned. Today, we focused on noticing and wondering about We Are the Ship. We began to organize what it's all about. Read the question on the screen as I read it aloud. Ready? What did you learn today about the Negro Leagues and why Rube Foster created them? Okay, so think about our full lesson today and answer that question. My challenge is, can you include the words segregation, discrimination, and racism in your response? Try it out. In the next lesson, we are going to explore the role of research, and we are explicitly going to talk about how Kadir Nelson, the author of our text, how he used research to write We Are the Ship. If you have any questions, please reach out. You can email us at info@greatminds.org for support. Thank you for learning with me today. Take care, and I will see you for our next lesson soon.